The plan was supposed to be simple. One long weekend, one crowded table, one normal holiday, where the worst thing that happened was someone overcooked the turkey and we all pretended it was just a little dry. We were 5 minutes into saying hello when my mother-in-law, Diane, looked at my wife and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I hope you didn't bring any expectations this year." That was the crack. The first tiny sound of glass breaking. I'm Nate. I married her daughter, Maris, 3 years ago, which means I'm close enough to see the gears turning, but not close enough to be blinded by them. I'm family, until I'm not. I'm the guy who sets the folding chairs, brings extra ice, and becomes a bad influence the second I don't nod along. We drove to their house in a rented SUV because ours was in the shop, and that detail mattered because Diane can smell inconvenience the way some people smell rain. "Oh, look at you," she said, eyeing the rental keys in my hand like they were evidence. "Must be nice to just rent things." Maris gave me a look that said, "Don't. Not yet." We walked in with a pie and a bottle of wine. Diane took the wine and frowned like we'd handed her a chore. "Is this from the grocery store?" she asked. "It's a decent one," I said, keeping my voice light. "Everything is overpriced now," she sighed, the martyr of modern commerce. Then, without missing a beat, she pointed at the new handbag on her own shoulder, one of those shiny, structured ones that looks like it comes with a security guard. "I had to buy this," she added, "for the pictures." She always said things like that, as if she was forced, as if the world demanded she spend money she didn't have to prove she existed. Inside, the house was decorated like a magazine spread. There were metallic place cards, fresh flowers, and 2 different scented candles fighting for dominance. Diane had a habit of complaining about the cost of eggs while ordering custom napkins with a monogram. Maris's dad, Graham, met us at the doorway, already wearing his calm like armor. He hugged Maris, shook my hand, and quietly took the pie like it was something precious. Graham was the kind of man who could make you feel seen without saying much. "Good to have you both," he said. Diane called from the living room. "Graham, did you tell them we changed dinner to 6? Because I don't want it late. Late dinners make me puffy." Graham didn't flinch. 6, he repeated to us, like a gentle translator. This was the rhythm. Diane's voice was the weather. Everyone else just carried umbrellas. We were barely settled before the first little comment landed. Diane leaned toward Maris as if sharing a secret and said, "Did you see what your cousin paid for daycare? People make such irresponsible choices." Her cousin Lex was literally in the kitchen slicing bread. Maris stiffened. I cleared my throat. "Daycare's expensive everywhere." Diane smiled at me the way someone smiles at a dog that just barked indoors. Well, some people plan better. Micro hook right there. She wasn't talking about daycare. She was talking about control, about who got to be smart and who got to be careless. It was a scoreboard in her head, and she updated it constantly. The rest of the family filtered in. Maris's brother, Owen, with his partner, Lex and her husband, Diane's sister, Jan, who moved like she was always bracing for impact. There was laughter and hugs and the normal chaos of coats and casseroles. And then there was Diane, floating above it all like the final boss of small talk. She did her usual routine, complain about inflation, brag about her steals, make a show of insisting she didn't want gifts, then immediately ask what everyone brought her. At one point, she held up a platter and said, "Can someone take a photo of me with this? The lighting here is terrible, but we'll fix it." Graham was in the kitchen, quietly checking the oven temperature like it was the only problem he could solve today. I liked Graham. Everybody liked Graham. Even people who didn't know him liked him. He was the kind of man you trust to hold a ladder steady. For years, I'd heard stories about how he made it. Not flashy, not loud, just steady. He ran a small engineering firm for decades. Nothing glamorous, but profitable. He didn't buy sports cars. He didn't talk about grind. He invested. He planned. He did the boring stuff that becomes powerful later. Diane, on the other hand, treated money like a performance. If she couldn't show it off, it didn't count. Maris and I sat at the kitchen island while Diane flitted around, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. Owen leaned beside us and whispered, "How long before she starts on the family photo lecture?" 10 minutes, I whispered back. Owen raised his eyebrows. "You're generous." Maris nudged him. "Be nice." Owen's partner, Kira, smiled in that careful way people do when they're trying not to step on a landmine. Then Diane appeared with a tray of drinks, like she was starring in her own show. "I made a special cocktail," she announced. "It's just a little something. Don't be boring." Graham didn't drink much. Diane did, especially on holidays, especially when there was an audience. She handed one to Maris. Maris hesitated. "I'm good with water." Diane's smile sharpened. "Of course, you always have to be disciplined." Maris took the water anyway. Diane handed me a drink. "Here, you look like you need it." I took it to avoid the scene. I didn't actually want it. But sometimes you accept the drink because declining is its own fight. We moved toward the living room. Diane started talking about her budget, which meant a detailed explanation of why she deserved nice things because the world was so unfair. "I swear," she said loud, "if prices go up one more time, I'm going to lose it." "Graham, did you see the quote for the new patio furniture? It's criminal." Jan nodded like she agreed, because Jan always nodded. Graham said calmly, "Then we don't do it." Diane laughed sharp. "We're not living like peasants." She said peasants like she'd never met one and didn't want to. Micro hook. It wasn't the money. It was the idea that she could ever be told no. Even the word itself seemed to itch her skin. Dinner started like most dinners do. People talking, passing plates, trying to keep it light. The table looked incredible. I'll give Diane that. She could put on a show, but the show always had a cost. Lex complimented the food. Diane accepted it like a queen accepting tribute. Graham asked about my work. I told him about a project I was handling. He listened, asked real questions, nodded like it mattered. It was such a small kindness, it felt almost shocking. Then Lex's husband, Rami, said something that was meant to be harmless. He smiled at Graham and said, "Hey, can I ask you something kind of practical? We've been looking at houses, it's wild out there. We're saving, but we were wondering if you ever did early help for a down payment. Like not asking. Just curious how you handled it with the kids." The room went quiet in that way it always does when someone says the word money at a family gathering. Like the air itself holds its breath. Maris froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Owen stared down at his plate. Kira blinked, then looked at the centerpiece like it was suddenly fascinating. Graham didn't look offended. If anything, he looked thoughtful. "That's a fair question," he said slowly. "We've helped in different ways. Sometimes it's not a lump sum. Sometimes it's setting things up ahead of time." Diane's eyes flicked to him. Graham continued, calm and careful. "Housing's tough right now. We've tried to make sure the kids have some footing." Rami nodded, relieved. Yeah, we're trying to be smart. It's just insane. Diane laughed, too loud. Smart, she repeated, like the word tasted funny. You know what's smart? Not expecting handouts. Lex's cheeks flushed. No one said. Diane waved her hand. I'm just saying people act like it's all guaranteed, like some magic pot of gold is waiting for them. Graham shifted slightly. Diane. But she was already leaning into it. The cocktail in her hand had turned her volume up and her filter off. You all talk about help and inheritance like it's some cute little family perk, she said. Like it's on a menu. Maris's jaw tightened so hard I could see it from across the table. I tried to keep my face neutral. Inside, I felt that familiar dread, the sense that we were watching a car drift toward a guardrail and nobody could reach the wheel. Rami held up his hands, palms open. Honestly, I didn't mean... Diane cut him off. No, let's just say it. Everyone's thinking it. Graham's voice stayed even. This isn't the time. Diane smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Oh, it's the perfect time, because I'm tired of the little conversations, the whispering, the hints. Jan murmured, Diane. Diane turned toward the table like she was addressing a jury. There is no inheritance, she announced, and the words landed heavy, like a plate dropped on tile. When Graham dies, I get what's his, and I will spend every cent. Silence. Not polite silence. Not, we don't talk about politics, silence. This was the kind of silence where you can hear someone's breathing change. Maris stared at her mother like she'd been slapped. Owen whispered, Jesus, under his breath. Kira's eyes widened. Lex looked down at her hands, as if trying to disappear into her own skin. Graham didn't move. He just set his fork down. Diane continued, fueled by the shock she'd created. I'm serious, she said, voice rising. Trips, jewelry, a new kitchen, whatever I want. Because I earned it. I put up with everything, and I'm not leaving a dime for anyone to fight over. There it was. The real message, hidden inside the speech. I control the story. I decide who gets what. I decide who you are. I felt my hand tighten around my water glass. Maris finally spoke, voice small but steady. Mom, why would you say that? Diane shrugged like it was obvious. Because it's true. Rami tried to salvage the moment. We weren't asking about... Diane waved him off again. You were thinking it. And you all think it's unfair when I spend money now? But guess what? I'm alive now. Graham's voice was quiet. Diane, stop. She looked at him, eyes glittering. What? Are you embarrassed? Don't be. Tell them, Graham. Tell them I'm right. Graham's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. Like a door closing softly. He glanced at Maris and Owen, then back at Diane. I can't let you talk like that, he said. Not like it's a threat. Diane scoffed. It's not a threat. It's a promise. Micro hook. The moment she said promise, I realized she wasn't joking. She wasn't venting. She was announcing a weapon she thought she owned. Maris pushed her chair back just slightly, 1 inch, but it spoke volumes. Owen's voice was flat. Cool. Happy holidays. Diane snapped her head toward him. Don't be dramatic. Owen laughed, bitter. You just told us you're going to spend everything out of spite and I'm the dramatic one. Diane's eyes narrowed. See? This is what I mean. You all feel entitled. Graham said, measured. No one is entitled. But this isn't how we talk to our family. Diane leaned forward, her bracelets clinking. Your family? I am your family. Graham's gaze stayed steady. Yes, which is why we handle this with respect. Diane's face tightened. Respect, she repeated. I don't get respect. I get judged. Maris's voice broke slightly. Mom, you're making this horrible. Diane turned to her like she'd been waiting for this. Oh, so now I'm horrible, because I told the truth. That was her trick. Say something cruel, then call it honesty. I reached under the table and gently touched Maris's knee, a quiet signal. I'm here. Breathe. Graham took a slow breath. We can talk about finances another time. Not tonight. Diane's laugh was small, sharp. Sure, because you don't want them to know. Graham didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence had weight. Diane stared at him, searching for a reaction she could use. Then she looked back at the table and said, like a stage whisper, just remember what I said. Don't count on anything. I'll spend it all. She took another drink, and in that moment, I watched the holiday split in two, before and after. Because I knew Diane well enough to understand. She didn't just light fires. She waited to see who would run to put them out. For about 10 minutes after Diane's promise, everyone did that thing families do when something ugly happens in public. They pretended they could smooth it out with gravy. Forks clinked. Someone asked about traffic. Lex complimented the centerpiece again like it could save us. Diane acted like she'd just delivered a motivational speech. She kept drinking, kept smiling, kept scanning the table for reactions she could collect. Graham stayed quiet, but his quiet felt different now. Not tired. Decided. Maris barely ate. I could see the heat in her face, the way she kept swallowing words to keep from crying at the table. Owen was tense in that controlled way, where you know the next thing out of his mouth will end the night. And me? I was sitting there thinking, if Diane can say that in front of everyone, what does she say when no one's watching? A little later, dishes were cleared. The group split into little clusters, kitchen, living room, back porch for the people who needed air. Diane switched into hostess mode, which was basically the same as manager mode. Nate, take the trash out, she said, not asking. I stood up. Sure. As I walked past her, she lowered her voice like we were co-conspirators. Maris is sensitive, she whispered. You'll learn. I stopped and looked at her. I've learned plenty. She blinked at me like she wasn't used to anyone replying with a spine. Micro hook. The second I didn't play along, I could feel myself being moved from helpful extra sun to problem. Outside, the air was cold enough to make my eyes water. Owen was on the porch, hands shoved in his pockets. He didn't look at me at first. Then he exhaled. She really said it. I nodded. Yeah. Owen's laugh had no humor. It's like she can't stand the idea that anything exists without her signature on it. Before I could respond, the sliding door opened and Maris stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself. She's going to ruin the whole night, Maris said, voice tight. Owen looked at his sister. She already did. Maris stared at the dark yard like it could offer instructions. Dad didn't even argue with her. He just went quiet. I said gently, that might be him choosing not to feed it. Maris swallowed. Or he's tired. That was the scary part. Graham looked like a man who'd been tired for a long time. We went back inside because that's what you do when you're trying to keep the peace in someone else's home. You re-enter the building where the fire started. In the kitchen, Graham was rinsing plates. Not because he had to, because doing something with his hands gave him an excuse not to be cornered. Diane was already cornering him anyway. She stood near the pantry, gesturing with her glass like a conductor. You know what I think? She was saying. I think people don't appreciate the life we built. They see the house, they see the holidays, and they think it's automatic. Graham didn't turn around. Diane, please. Diane's eyes slid to me, then to Maris and Owen behind me. Oh, good, she said. The audience is back. Maris stiffened. Mom, stop. Diane took a step closer to Graham. Tell them, Graham. Tell them you worked, and I supported you. Graham finally turned, calm as ever. I'm not doing this. Diane's smile twitched. Why? Afraid they'll ask questions? Graham didn't blink. No. Afraid you'll turn it into a weapon. That line hit the room like a dropped glass. Micro hook. When Graham finally named what she was doing, Diane didn't deny it. She just got louder. Diane's voice rose immediately. Oh, please. Everything is a weapon to you. I'm not allowed to talk. I'm not allowed to feel. I'm not allowed to... Maris cut in quietly. You are allowed, but you don't get to threaten people. Diane's eyes narrowed. Threaten? That's rich. Owen shook his head and muttered, Unreal. Diane snapped at him. Don't talk to me like that in my house. Owen's face went blank. Then don't talk to us like we're strangers. Graham raised a hand. Not sharp, just a simple, enough. Everyone, he said. Let's pause. He looked at Rami, who'd wandered into the kitchen with a stack of plates, clearly regretting having said anything about housing. Rami, Graham added, you asked a question earlier. I'll answer it simply, so this doesn't turn into whatever this is. Rami looked trapped. Mr. Hale, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to start anything. You didn't, Graham said. He leaned his hip against the counter. He looked at Maris and Owen first, like he was checking if they were okay with him sharing this. Then he spoke in that quiet, careful way that makes you listen. When you kids were little, he said, I started putting money away. Not in my name, in yours. Diane's head tilted slightly. What are you talking about? Graham ignored the edge in her voice and kept going. I opened custodial accounts, he said, using the simplest words. They were gifts. Once the money went in, it wasn't mine anymore. It legally belonged to the kids. Maris blinked. Dad. Graham nodded. Some of it was for education. Some of it was for a first home. Some just invested long term. It's not a secret. It's just not dinner conversation. Diane's face went still. Hold on. You're saying, Graham continued, still calm. It means there isn't a single pile of money waiting for someone to claim later. It's already allocated, already owned. The kitchen went quiet again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was clarity. Micro hook. Diane didn't look confused. She looked betrayed, like the world had broken a rule she'd invented. Her voice dropped, suddenly sharp. So you gave away our money? Graham's eyebrows lifted slightly. I gave gifts to our children, over time. Diane laughed once, loud and brittle. Gifts? Oh my God. Maris stepped closer to her father. Dad, I didn't know it was... Graham held up a hand. You weren't supposed to feel like you were waiting for anything. That was the point. Diane's eyes flicked around the room, calculating. So what? Owen has an account, and Maris has an account, and what about me? Graham's voice stayed steady. You have what we've always had. The house, the living expenses, the life. Diane's mouth tightened. That's not an answer. Graham didn't raise his voice. It's the truth. Diane turned to me like I was suddenly part of the crime scene. You knew about this? She demanded. I shook my head. No. She snapped back at Maris. You knew. Maris looked genuinely hurt. No, Mom, I didn't. Diane's gaze slid to Owen. You knew. Owen laughed, harsh. If I knew, Do you think I'd be renting a place with a kitchen from 1997? Kira stepped in softly. Diane, nobody's against you. Diane spun toward her. Don't. Then she pivoted back to Graham, and her voice climbed. And that money was supposed to be mine if something happened to you, she said. That's how marriage works. Graham's expression barely changed. Marriage isn't a scavenger hunt. Diane's cheeks flushed red. How dare you speak to me like that? Graham didn't move. How dare you speak to your children like they're enemies? Micro-hook. The moment Graham said enemies, Diane's eyes flashed, and I realized she'd been playing that exact game for years, just with better lighting. Diane stepped back as if she'd been pushed. Then she lunged forward again, pointing a finger at the counter, at the air, at anything she could aim at. This is theft, she said. This is you hiding money from me. Graham's voice was almost gentle. It's not hidden. It's documented. Diane's laugh turned into something uglier. Documented. Great. So you're proud. Maris's voice cracked. Mom, please stop. Diane turned on her daughter. No, you stop. You sit there acting shocked like you haven't benefited. Maris stared at her. Benefited from what? My own father trying to make sure his kids don't drown? Diane's eyes glistened, not with sadness, with fury. She looked around the kitchen, like she was suddenly aware of who was watching, and that mattered more than what happened. So this is what you all think of me, she said loudly. The villain, the greedy wife, the bad guy. No one answered fast enough, so Diane answered for us. Fine, she said. Enjoy your little accounts. She grabbed her phone off the counter with a shaky hand. She jabbed at the screen like it had personally offended her. Then she turned to Graham again, voice low and venomous. This isn't over, she said. Graham didn't flinch. I know. Diane looked at the room one last time, like she was trying to memorize who would later be forced to apologize to her. Then she stormed down the hallway and slammed the bedroom door so hard, a framed photo rattled on the wall. The house fell into this stunned quiet. Rami whispered, I'm so sorry. Graham exhaled slowly. You didn't do this. Maris stood there, eyes wet, not crying yet, just holding it in with sheer will. I wrapped an arm around her, and she leaned into me like she'd been carrying a weight all evening and finally found somewhere safe to set it down. And that's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text notification. Not from Diane. From Jan, Diane's sister, already trying to patch the damage. It read, She's upset. Don't take it personally. She's had a hard year. Can you all just be gentle? Micro-hook. The cleanup crew had arrived before the mess even dried. I stared at that screen and felt something in me settle, because I knew what came next. Not an apology, not accountability, a campaign. We left early, not dramatically. No shouting, no slammed doors from our side. Just the slow, exhausted kind of leaving where you gather your coat and your dignity at the same time. Graham walked us to the entryway. His face looked older than it had at dinner. I'm sorry, Maris said to him, voice thick. I didn't know she'd... Graham shook his head gently. You don't need to apologize for someone else's choices. He looked at me. Thanks for keeping steady. I nodded. Anytime. Behind him, the bedroom door stayed closed. Diane didn't come out. That was her style. Withdraw, then rewrite. When we got to the rental SUV, Maris sat in the passenger seat and just stared at the dashboard like it had answers. Owen texted us 20 minutes later. She's telling everyone she got attacked in her own kitchen. Kira added a separate message. She's saying Graham confessed he's been hiding money. I read those texts and felt my stomach drop, not because they were shocking, but because they were predictable. Diane didn't just explode. She documented her explosion in other people's mouths. Maris whispered, "I'm so tired." I reached for her hand. "We don't have to keep doing this." She squeezed my fingers. "I know." And that's when my phone buzzed again. A new message. From Diane this time. It was a single line. "You embarrassed me. No, sorry. No, I shouldn't have. No, I was out of line. Just a bill she expected us to pay." Microhook. When someone hurts you and then charges you for the inconvenience, you realize you were never a person to them, just a role. By the time we got home, there were already calls happening. First it was Jan again, leaving a voicemail. "Honey, she's just emotional. She didn't mean it like that." Then it was Lex, texting Maris. "Can you please call your mom tomorrow? She's saying she feels betrayed." Then it was some aunt I'd met twice, messaging me like we were close. Families shouldn't fight over money. Be the bigger people. I sat on our couch and watched the pattern unfold in real time. Not one person asked, "Are you okay?" Not one person said, "That was inappropriate." They all treated Diane's behavior like weather we were responsible for forecasting. Maris didn't answer anyone that night. She went into the bedroom, changed into sweats, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hands, trembling slightly like her body hadn't gotten the memo that we were safe now. I sat beside her. "She's going to punish you," I said quietly. Maris nodded without looking up. She always does. "How?" Maris swallowed. Silence. Then guilt. Then the "I might be dying" texts. Then she recruits people. "And if that doesn't work?" Maris finally looked at me. Then she gets creative. The next morning, creative showed up right on schedule. Graham called Maris around 10. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath it. "She's demanding access," he said, "to everything." Maris sat up straighter. "Access to what?" "She says if it's family money, she should have a say," Graham replied. "She wants login information. She wants to review accounts." Maris's face tightened. "That's insane." Graham paused. "She's also telling people I've been hiding things." Maris looked at me, eyes wide. I mouthed, "Here we go." Graham continued. "She wants me to fix it by changing arrangements." Maris's voice went flat. "You can't. It's not yours." Graham said softly, "Exactly." Microhook. The moment Diane realized she couldn't spend the money, she tried to claim the power behind it. By noon, Diane had escalated from texts to calls. She called Maris first. Maris didn't answer, so Diane called me. I stared at the screen. Diane's name. The little ringtone we'd set months ago because Maris insisted it would make her mother feel included. I answered because ignoring it would just create a bigger story later. "Hi, Diane," I said. There was a beat of silence like she was surprised I picked up. Then she exhaled dramatically. "Finally." "Maris is resting," I said. "What's going on?" Diane's voice turned sugary. "I just want to clear the air. I was humiliated yesterday." I kept my tone neutral. "You made a statement that shocked everyone." Diane snapped, "Oh, so now I'm the villain." "I didn't say that," I replied. "But you're thinking it," she said. "And you're letting my daughter think it." I took a slow breath. "Diane, nobody wants a fight, but you can't threaten your family over inheritance." "It's not a threat," she insisted. "It's reality." "The reality," I said carefully, "is that Graham set money aside for the kids. That doesn't take anything away from you." Her voice sharpened. "It takes away what's mine." Legally, I said. It's theirs. There was another silence, this one colder. Then she said, "You're very confident for someone who married in." Microhook. She didn't argue facts. She attacked my place in the family. I kept my voice steady. "I'm confident because I was standing there, and I watched you hurt your daughter." Diane laughed softly, like I was adorable. "Oh, please. Maris is dramatic." I felt my jaw tighten. No, she was heartbroken. Diane's tone flipped again, sharp, urgent. "Put her on the phone." "No," I said. "Not like this." Diane inhaled hard. "Excuse me?" "She'll call you when she's ready," I repeated. Diane's voice went low. "If she doesn't, there will be consequences." I blinked once. What consequences? She didn't answer directly. She didn't have to. With Diane, consequences meant social punishment, family pressure, a storyline. "You know," she said, "I've always defended you. People had concerns, Nate, but I defended you." I almost laughed, because it was so perfectly her, like my marriage was a product she endorsed. "Diane," I said, "we're not doing this." "Oh, you're doing it," she hissed. "You're turning my family against me." I didn't raise my voice. "We're choosing peace." She scoffed. "Peace? That's what weak people call surrender." And then she hung up. Maris stared at me from the bed. "What did she say?" I sat down beside her and told her the highlights. Maris listened, eyes glossy. "She said consequences?" I nodded. Maris's shoulders sagged. "She's going to call everyone." "She already is," I said. On cue, my phone buzzed again. A group text. Family members we barely talked to. Diane had created one of those holiday love group chats months ago and kept it alive by posting photos and passive commentary. Now, the new message read, "Diane, I'm devastated. After all I've done, I'm being treated like an outsider in my own marriage. Please pray for our family. I don't know why my children hate me." I stared at it. The audacity was almost impressive. Maris's lip trembled. She said we hate her. I said quietly, "She needs it to be that extreme. Because if it's we hate her, then she's the victim. If it's she hurt us, then she's responsible." Microhook. That's when I realized it wasn't about money at all. It was about control of the narrative. That afternoon, Graham came over. He didn't announce it. He just showed up at our door like a man who needed a safe place to stand. He looked tired, not confused, not guilty, just done. Maris hugged him the second she opened the door, and for a moment he looked like he might fall apart. But he didn't. He held her the way you hold something fragile you can't replace. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we ate cheap takeout and planned our week and argued about what show to watch. Graham placed a folder on the table. Not a dramatic folder, not a threat, just paperwork. "I spoke to our attorney this morning," he said. Maris's eyes widened. "Dad," Graham held up a hand, gentle. "Not because I want to fight, because I want clarity." He opened the folder and slid a few pages toward Maris. "These are summaries, accounts in your name, Owen's, the kids." Maris blinked. "The kids?" Graham nodded. "I set up accounts for your children too. Not huge, just steady. It grows." Maris's eyes filled instantly. "Dad." Graham's voice softened. "I didn't want them to ever feel like they were bargaining for stability." I looked at the pages, then at him. "So Diane can't touch it?" Graham nodded. "She can't. That's what set her off." Maris whispered, "She thinks you stole from her." Graham's mouth tightened. "She thinks anything she can't control is theft." Microhook. That sentence sounded like something he'd learned the hard way. Maris took a shaky breath. What happens now? Graham leaned back slightly, hands folded. Now I set a boundary. A real one. Maris swallowed. Like what? Graham looked at his daughter and then at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen from him before. Steel. I told her, he said. There will be no access, no logins, no reviews. If she continues to lie about me or pressure the kids, I will separate finances formally. Maris's eyes widened. You mean? Graham nodded. Yes. I felt my chest tighten. That was a big step. A line you don't draw unless you're ready to accept what happens next. Maris whispered, She'll explode. Graham's voice stayed calm. Then she explodes. He turned to me. Nate, I need you to understand something. This isn't about a number in an account. It's about her needing everyone to orbit her fear. I nodded slowly. Graham continued. I've spent years smoothing things over because it was easier than fighting, but I'm done making you kids pay the price for her comfort. Maris started crying then. Quiet tears, not dramatic, just relief finally escaping. I reached for her hand. Graham looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. I'm not asking you to choose sides, he said. I'm asking you to choose sanity. Micro hook. Hearing that word, sanity, felt like permission. That evening, Diane showed up. Not at our door. She wasn't that direct. She wasn't brave like that. She showed up in our driveway, sitting in her car, and she called Maris 3 times in a row. Maris watched the phone ring. Her face was pale. She's outside, Maris whispered. I looked through the window. Diane's car idled, headlights off like she was trying to be invisible while being extremely visible. Maris's phone buzzed again. Diane. I'm here. Don't ignore your mother. Then, Diane. Open the door. Then, Diane. If you don't, I'll know where I stand. Maris stared at the screen like it was a trap. Graham was still at our table, hands clasped, watching his daughter. He said softly, You don't have to do anything. Maris inhaled, shaky. She's going to make a scene. She can, I said, from the driveway. Morris looked at me, and I saw her trying to decide between old programming and new reality. Then she set her phone down. She didn't answer. For a few minutes, Diane's car just sat there. Then the driver's door opened, and Diane stepped out, smoothing her coat like she was arriving at a gala. She walked to our front door and knocked. Not hard, just enough to be heard. Then she knocked again. Maris didn't move. Diane knocked a 3rd time, louder. Graham stood up slowly. Maris grabbed his arm. Dad, don't. Graham looked at her. I'm not going to fight. I'm going to end it. He walked to the door and opened it. Diane's face lit up like she'd won something. Finally, she said. Graham stepped outside and gently closed the door behind him so we could still see through the window, but not hear everything. We watched. Diane's hands moved rapidly. She was talking fast, animated, like she could out-talk reality. Graham barely moved. He stood still, shoulders squared, calm. Diane pointed at the house, then at herself, then at the sky as if God was her witness. Graham said something short. Diane's mouth dropped open. She tried again, bigger gestures, leaning in. Graham said another short sentence. Diane's face twisted. She looked back at the window, toward Maris, like she wanted us to see her suffering. Then she did something I recognized from 100 other moments. She put on a performance. She lifted a hand to her chest. She shook her head slowly. She looked wounded. Then she spun on her heel, got back in her car, and drove off, fast. Graham came back inside. Maris's voice was small. "What did you say?" Graham exhaled, like he'd just set down a weight. "I told her," he said, "that the money is not hers." Maris blinked. Graham continued, calm, clear. "And I told her this. If she keeps using our children as leverage, she will lose more than access. She will lose us." Maris covered her mouth with her hand, crying quietly. I felt something steady in my chest. Relief, grief, both. Graham looked at Maris and said the final line like a man stating a fact, not negotiating. "I won't fund disrespect," he said, "and I won't reward threats." After he left, our house felt unusually quiet, not empty. Quiet in a good way, like the kind of quiet you get after you shut down a loud machine you didn't realize was stressing your nervous system. Maris curled into my side on the couch. "She's going to tell everyone we abandoned her," Maris whispered. I kissed her forehead. "Let her." Maris sniffed. "It still hurts." "I know," I said, "but it hurts less than living in her storm." She was silent for a moment, then she said, almost to herself, "So that's it. She can't spend what she can't control." I looked at the dark window, at the driveway where her car had been, and I thought about Diane's big holiday announcement, how she'd wanted to scare everyone into obedience with the idea of money. In the end, the irony was simple. She didn't lose an inheritance. She lost the audience.